Elizabeth at A Literary Princess. If you are new here, welcome. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists, and as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have an installment of the George Eliot Project for you. The George Eliot Project is something that I started in January of 2023, and it was to read all of George Eliot's fiction, so novels and short stories, in publication order. It was meant to last only for 2023, but some things happened, some things being the mill on the floss, and it had to be extended into 2024. However, I am almost done. So today we are talking about the March read for the George Eliot Project, which was also my read for March of the Mammoths. And this is Middlemarch. Now, I have a long and complicated history with George Eliot in general, which is actually why I started this project, but also with Middlemarch. I had tried to read this, I believe, 3 times before and never made it past like chapter 5. I then read it in, I believe, 2021 for my qualifying exams. And it took me, hold on, I'm gonna look that up and let you know how long it took me because it was a while. So I started reading this at the beginning of August of 2021 and I finished it on October 31st of 2021. So that's actually not as long as I thought it was. I thought it was way longer than that, but I mean, that's still a while. And I had DNF'd it in 2019 and also a few times before that. So after finishing it in 2021, I began to refer to this book as my nemesis because I didn't like it. Really, I'm not gonna say at all. I gave it 3 stars and there were parts that I really liked. However, I found it so slow. I was heavily skimming at parts. I felt there were too many characters and that the different stories didn't mesh well together because we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to first give you some history on the book and a little bit of a summary, and then I will tell you my thoughts. There will be spoilers in this video. I find it very difficult to talk about George Eliot books without giving spoilers, unfortunately. So please do be aware, if you keep watching this video, you are going to know what happens in the book. I had somebody complaining about that on my Mill on the Floss video, where I had forgotten to give a spoiler warning. But all of these George Eliot Project videos do have spoilers. So let's jump in. Middlemarch was published in 8 installments from 1871 to 1872 and was then put out in a single volume. So it was originally 2 separate stories. There was a story called Middlemarch and there was a story called Miss Brooke, and George Eliot eventually combined them. This is set in the fictional town of Middlemarch. It is about characters in and around the town of Middlemarch in the early 1830s. So this is covering the 1832 Reform Act, which we saw George Eliot deal with a bit in Felix Holt the Radical. We are dealing with the beginning of the railway system, and we are also dealing with a lot of medical reform. So the 2 main characters of the original 2 short stories were Dorothea Brooke, for Miss Brooke, and Dr. Tertius Lydgate. I only know how to pronounce that because I watched the mini-series. Lydgate is a doctor who has newly come to Middlemarch. He has great dreams of medical reform, and the people of Middlemarch are kind of pushed back against that because they don't like change. So We are following the stories of these two characters, Dorothea as she gets married to Mr. Casaubon, who is old enough to be her father and is a scholar working on this key to all mythologies. And she thinks that by marrying this great man who is doing great work, she will be able to help him achieve greatness and therefore do something with her life. It doesn't work out well for her. It turns out Mr. Casaubon is not really that great of a guy, and his research is really not that good, and it's a whole thing. She becomes very disillusioned. In the meantime, his young cousin, Will Ladislaw, comes into the picture. Will Ladislaw kind of doesn't have much of a purpose. He doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, but some sparks fly between him and Dorothea. In the meantime, Lydgate is, doing his doctor thing in Middlemarch, and he meets Rosamond Vincy, the daughter of the mayor, and isn't intending to fall in love with her and marry her, but ultimately does after kind of a flirtation that she seems to take more seriously than he does. So they get married and they begin racking up a lot of debt that Lydgate just doesn't have the money to pay. We also follow Rosamond's brother, Fred Vincy, who is another... Let me try to be nice. Because Fred's really not that bad of a person. He's just kind of useless. He has gone to college. His father wants him to become a clergyman. He doesn't really know what he wants to do. He just kind of wants to inherit his Uncle Featherstone's land and money and, be a gentleman and race horses all day. He has a lot of debt racked up. And he has a childhood sweetheart, Mary Garth, who is from a poor family. And she doesn't think he should be a clergyman because she does not think he is called for it. And she also refuses to have it really, become romantically involved with him and agree to marry him until he is a more useful human being. So, we also have going on the banker, Nicholas Bulstrode, who kind of owns most of the town of Middlemarch. And he's kind of sketchy. And he ends up being wrapped into this whole thing involving money and inheritance that has been stolen from the person it should have been given to, and it's a whole mess. And he is basically exposed by this former acquaintance, Mr. Raffles, who comes into town to blackmail him. So that's kind of the basics of what we have going on in Middlemarch. It's a lot. There is a lot of characters. There's a lot of plot. I mean, I feel like I didn't even cover half of it. Dorothea's uncle is running for parliament and makes a total fool of himself. There is so much going on here. I mean, it's like an 800 and something page book. So, what were my thoughts this time? I cannot call it my nemesis anymore because I actually really liked it. I don't know if it's because I read it in just a month instead of over the course of basically 3 months, or if I'm just in a better place to understand it now that I have read so much more of George Eliot's work. But I liked it so much more. So when I first read it, I felt that the two short stories that Eliot had, Miss Brooke and Middlemarch, didn't really connect enough to be in one book. It just felt like she kind of threw it together and the book is all over the place and very slow and meandering. Now, the book is slow and meandering. And George Eliot's pacing has been my issue through this whole series, the only two I've felt are well-paced are Romola and Felix Holt, which were the two preceding this, so I don't know how we went backwards in our ability to pace things, but it's fine. It's fine. So I do think that the pacing in this book is off. That's her constant problem. However, I do now see the way that these stories connect. Basically, Dorothea and Lydgate are both people who want to do great things. They want to make a change in the world and do good. And yet they are not able to because of their circumstances. Dorothea, because she is a woman, really, and Lydgate because he does not have the money to. So that is kind of the whole crux of this book. And yes, we also have the reform and all of that, but at the heart is the story of these two people who want to do great things but can't. And there actually are a lot of scenes of the two of them interacting, because Lydgate is the doctor for Mr. Casaubon when he is ill, and when he dies, he dies. Dorothea helps Lydgate when he gets kind of sucked into the whole issue with Bulstrode and when people are questioning his integrity. So there are a lot of scenes of them interacting. And what I kind of came away with this time is that if Dorothea and Lydgate had gotten married, we wouldn't be having any of these problems. I think that they are the best suited for each other in this whole book. Because another thing that this book is really about is mismatched marriages. Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon are ridiculous. Like, it's everybody thinks it's ridiculous. They're like, he is old enough to be your father. Why are you marrying him? You are 20 years old. So they are extremely mismatched. And she kind of does approach this like she's looking for a father figure. She's always talking about how she wants to be what Milton's daughters were to Milton. I'm like, girl, that's not a marriage. And then we have Rosamond and Lydgate. Rosamond, who just wants to move up in the world and be of a higher class, and Lydgate, who really does not care about that. He wants to help people and reform the medical system. So they are not matched to each other. And then we have Fred and Mary. Fred, he's useless man. George Eliot has a lot of useless men. He's probably the least harmful of the useless men, but somehow I find him the most frustrating. And we have Mary Garth, who is severely practical and honestly just the best character. The best character ever. And there's a great quote from her mother that I highlighted the first time I read it and had a tab in it, but unfortunately I took all my tabs out, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find this again. Okay. Here it is. So this is just after, it's a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Garth, Mary's parents, and he says, he is saying about how Fred has his heart fixed on Mary and Mary likes him. It is a pity for Mary, I think, said Mrs. Garth. Why a pity? Because, Caleb, she might have had a man who is worth 20 Fred Vinceys. And that man she is talking about is Mr. Fairbrother, who is a clergyman, who is in love with Mary, and who would have been such a better choice. He's like a really good person. He has his issues. He was gambling at the beginning of the book because he was not making enough to support his elderly mother and I believe like an aunt and a sister. But he was not in debt because he always won, unlike Fred, who always lost. And as soon as he was given a living by Dorothea, he stopped gambling. He wasn't addicted, he was just trying to make ends meet. So I literally, the note that I had with that quote was preach, because I was with Mrs. Garth. I was like, Fred Vincy is useless and Mary Garth is an angel and should have had somebody more worthy of her, but she loved Fred. So there's our other mismatched couple. And then so Dorothea ends up, after Mr. Casaubon's death, she ends up marrying Will Ladislaw, Mr. Casaubon's cousin. And even they are rather mismatched, because he is like this kind of wandering in the wind, not really sure what he wants to do, and she knows that she wants to do great things. And in order to marry him, she has to give up everything she inherited from Mr. Casaubon, because Mr. Casaubon realized Ladislaw was in love with Dorothea and wrote it into his will that if she married Ladislaw, she would lose everything. So she could have been doing her great things if she kept the money. But she gives it up and marries Will Ladislaw. And they just don't seem matched in ambition to me, personally. Like I said, I really think that Lydgate and Dorothea would have made the best match. But Lydgate, at the beginning of the book, is always talking about how he wants like a very pretty, lovely wife who he can just come home and relax with. He actually sees Dorothea and is like, she's way too severe to marry. But if they had gotten married, they both would have been able to do their good things, because Lydgate would have had the money to go on with his medical research because Dorothea brought money. And Dorothea would have been able to help him with that, and they would have done great things. It's fine. It's fine. So I am able to see, all that to say, I am able to see now how these stories connect. And I really liked a lot of what it was saying about marriage. The politics and the reform stuff, like, I feel I don't really know enough about that. I'm not very interested in politics in like the Victorian period or any other period. That's not why I want to read Victorian literature generally. But I think I understood more than I did the first time. I was definitely paying attention more than I was the first time. I actually found the plot with Bulstrode really interesting. I honestly didn't remember any of it from the first time I'd read it. So there is that. So yeah, it did work for me as a story more this time. I still think the pacing's off, but I can see it as a cohesive single story. Lots of little sub-stories, but they do all come together for me. Now, I will say, everybody that I hear on BookTube that talks about this book and enjoys it is always talking about how much they love Dorothea. I still hate Dorothea. I found her insufferable the first time I read this, and I still found her insufferable. She is just so self-righteous and just dumb. She makes bad choices. I'm sitting there like, you idiot. So if you all know the I'm so annoyed BookTube tag, there's a question about do you get annoyed with characters' choices? I was annoyed with her choices here. I was annoyed with a lot of people's choices here, but especially Dorothea's. I don't know if it's because I wanted her to be better than that or what, but she just irritated the hell out of me. She is of this trope that we also see in Romola that me and my professor started referring to as the angel in the library. So the Victorian period, there's this big idea of the angel in the house, of the ideal woman who is domestic. And both of those characters, Romola and Dorothea, kind of are trying to fit that, except instead of being domestic, they're like being in the library and helping for Dorothea, her husband, and for Romola, her father, with their scholarly pursuits, but like trying to really devote themselves to it to help these great men achieve great things. It irritated me. God, when Dorothea moved away from that, like I had like, my note was like, yay, we're moving away from the angel in the library. She finally realized what a jerk Casaubon is. Very exciting. So I do find Dorothea really irritating. That doesn't mean that I didn't like the book though, and I do think she's an amazing character. Now, what George Eliot does best is just the psychology of the characters, and that really comes through here. I mean, I think this and Daniel Deronda are the best for the psychological realism of the characters. And I think that is a large part of why Middlemarch is considered such a great book, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, English novel. So she's a great character, she just irritates me. And I'm irritated with most of the characters. I remember really liking Rosamond the first time I read it. Oh, I hated her this time. There is a point where she is pregnant and she is told by her husband, you know, the doctor, not to go horseback riding. And she does it anyway. And there's an accident and she miscarries. And I remember being so offended the first time I read it because there was something about like how her willfulness had caused it. Basically, I was like, oh, willfulness causes miscarriages now. Reading it this time, I was like, listen to your doctor husband. I think he kind of knows what he's talking about. But Lydgate also irritated me because he just was so clueless about money and just racks up all these debts that were unnecessary. Irritating. And we all know how I feel about Fred now. So Mary Garth is my shining star of this book. She is my favorite character. I would have loved more of Mary Garth, but alas. So I ultimately gave this book 4 stars. I did really enjoy it a lot more. So it has moved up from 3 and really it's kind of more of a 2.5. I'm gonna be honest. Like it had been on my least favorite books of the year list. That's how much I really didn't like it, but I always feel like I can't rate Victorian books lower than 3 stars, especially when it's like, you know, Middlemarch. So I'd given it 3, but it is bumped up to a very solid 4. And I'm kind of like, it's really just below Felix Holt for me. Like, so that means this is right now, not counting Daniel Deronda because I don't know where I'm going to place that. This is like in 3rd place. So how things change. It's not my nemesis anymore. I think I'm still going to just kind of lovingly call it my nemesis because I like that for it. But yes, I enjoyed Middlemarch way more. I see why everyone loves it so much. It's still not a 5-star for me because of the pacing issues, but this is an excellent novel. So, for April, I am reading Daniel Deronda. That will probably be coming up in May because as you can tell by when this is coming up, I am not putting these up on time at all. It's fine. And then in May, I will be reading Impressions of Theophrastus Such, which is a series of fictional essays, but I will deal with that in May. But then I'll be done. And I will be doing a kind of final thoughts and wrap-up video where I rank all of the books and talk about why I've placed them, where I've placed them. So, let me know down in the comments below, have you read Middlemarch? What did you think? Do you agree with some of my assessment? Do you disagree? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.